Welcome to The Explainer. If you're joining us, you're likely looking for some really clear, structured insights into one of the most complex areas of mental health. Today, we're setting the stage for an empathetic, yet totally objective, clinical exploration of how mental health and addiction intersect. We're specifically zeroing in on what happens when these two really powerful forces collide in the context of cluster B personality disorders.
It's a high-stakes question, right? See, for decades, traditional psychiatry has separated personality disorders and substance use into completely different silos. But by doing that, we've missed the explosive reality of what actually happens when they combine. I mean, think about it. What happens when profound emotional instability collides head-on with the ultimate external regulator? Okay, let's dive into this. We're going to cover diagnostic tunnel vision, define cluster B personalities, look at the addiction collision, explore the tangled roots and mechanisms, discuss shared psychological vulnerabilities, and finally, wrap up with transdiagnostic treatment approaches.
Section 1. The diagnostic tunnel vision. Look, our modern diagnostic system loves neat little boxes. It gives us structure, billing codes, and clear clinical guidelines. But as we all know, real human suffering doesn't exactly fit perfectly into neat boxes.
And this brilliantly illustrates exactly what I mean. Notice the root systems below the surface there. In traditional diagnostics, we tend to just look at the trees above ground, addiction, ADHD, depression, schizophrenia, and we treat them as entirely separate entities. But as a 2025 review points out, underneath the soil, these conditions are growing from deeply intertwined biological and environmental roots. They're interconnected systems. The authors of that research actually hit the nail on the head here. They note that maintaining a conceptual divide between addictions and other psychiatric disorders basically just reinforces this diagnostic tunnel vision. Keeping addiction completely walled off from other mental health conditions doesn't just create gaps in care, it literally blocks us from developing effective treatments for patients suffering from both. To vividly demonstrate this transdiagnostic overlap, let's move right into Section 2, defining cluster B personalities. At a baseline, a personality disorder refers to a lifelong struggle to form healthy, functional relationships, or to develop an adaptive sense of self. When we talk specifically about cluster B, as it's outlined in the DSM-5, we're looking at a group of conditions characterized by dramatic, overly emotional, erratic, and unpredictable behaviors. We aren't just talking about someone having a bad day. These are deeply ingrained, lifelong traits that make just navigating the world incredibly distressing. The two disorders in this cluster that are most heavily associated with addiction are antisocial personality disorder, or ASPD, and borderline personality disorder, or BPD. Check out the contrast here. ASPD tends to manifest outwardly, disregard for the rights of others, aggression, impulsivity. BPD, on the flip side, is characterized by severe affective instability, desperate fears of abandonment, and extreme emotional dysregulation. So while one leans toward external aggression and the other toward internal distress, both involve really severe behavioral manifestations and a deeply unstable sense of self. Which brings us to Section 3, the addiction collision. I gotta warn you, the data from SAMHSA, the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, that we're about to see is absolutely staggering. 75%. That is the percentage of individuals with borderline personality disorder who will experience a substance use disorder in their lifetime. Just let that sink in for a second. 3/4 of the people fighting this severe emotional instability will also find themselves battling addiction. It's massive. And that overlap extends across the board. The SAMHSA data highlights how deeply these conditions are linked. If someone has ASPD, BPD, or major depression, their odds of having a co-occurring alcohol use disorder are 1.2 to 6.4 times higher than the general population. And the clinical reality is harsh, folks. People with these dual disorders face much higher treatment dropout rates, significantly more severe symptoms, and much more persistent substance use. Section 4, tangled roots and mechanisms. Okay, so we know what is happening, but now we really need to understand why. Let's dig below the surface of these symptoms. So, the crucial point is this. When approximately 50% of people with any personality disorder also have a comorbid substance use disorder, this massive comorbidity isn't just some wild coincidence. It's a fundamental neurobiological reality. We are quite literally looking at the exact same root system. Let's break down those biological roots.
Large-scale genetic studies have found that psychiatric disorders and addictions share a super high genetic heritability overlap, in some cases around 30%. But it's not just genetics, it's the actual plumbing of the brain. Both conditions feature disrupted dopaminergic and opioid systems, meaning the brain's reward processing is just completely abnormal. Combine that with impaired executive control in the prefrontal cortex, and you have a brain highly vulnerable to both impulsive behaviors and the tight grip of addiction.
Section 5. Shared psychological vulnerabilities. Biology is only half the story, right? We need to transition to the psychodynamic perspective to truly understand the internal emotional landscape of someone battling a cluster B disorder and addiction simultaneously.
Psychodynamic theory gives us some really profound insights here. It suggests that individuals with these conditions often possess a very fragile core ego. This leads to what clinicians call a failure in symbolization, which is really just a clinical way of saying they lack the ability to evoke internal soothing qualities. When they feel distress, they just cannot self-soothe. Furthermore, psychoanalysts discuss this fascinating concept called jouissance. It's a paradoxical state of pleasure that is simultaneously enjoyable, yet entirely intolerable, which leads to overwhelming internal distress. So think about it. When you literally cannot soothe yourself, you are forced to look outside of yourself. Empathetically speaking, substance use often doesn't start as some reckless choice. It begins as a desperate neurobiological and psychological coping mechanism. It acts as an external regulator. For a person with a cluster B personality disorder who is drowning in an intolerable internal state, a drug is simply an attempt to emulate the soothing qualities they lack internally and to build a wall against that overwhelming distress.
Let's move to and see how this builds into Section 6, transdiagnostic treatment approaches. If the problem is intertwined, the solution absolutely has to be too. Let's zoom out and look at how we treat the whole root system. Because the vulnerabilities are shared, that impaired executive control, that desperate need for external regulation, we can actually use transtherapeutic tools. Mindfulness-based interventions, or MBIs, are a prime example. These treatments teach patients to self-monitor their cognitive and emotional processes, which allows them to consciously alter their habituated, reward-based responses to stress. Let's walk through the exact mechanism of change here. First, patients learn to self-monitor. Just by observing their distress without immediately reacting, they gain critical seconds of executive control. Second, they use that awareness to modify those maladaptive coping responses, say choosing a healthy grounding technique rather than reaching for a substance. And third, over time, this targets and disrupts the brain's ingrained reward-based learning. This step-by-step process literally breaks the cycle of needing an external regulator. And we're seeing incredible success when we cross those old diagnostic boundaries. Take dialectical behavior therapy, or DBT. This was originally designed specifically to treat the severe emotional dysregulation of borderline personality disorder. But because it targets those shared foundational roots, it has proven highly effective in reducing substance use as well. A therapy siloed for a personality disorder is successfully treating addictions simultaneously. That is a game changer. Now, what's really interesting about this slide is it brings us full circle back to our root systems. Remember our trees? We can't just trim the branches of addiction while completely ignoring the roots of the personality disorder, or vice versa. The evidence demands that effective psychiatric care must target the transdiagnostic roots, integrated collaborative care that addresses the genetics, the environment, brain function, and psychopathology as one unified system. That's the only logical path forward. Which leaves us with a final, provocative thought to summarize our explainer today. The data is absolutely clear. The psychological pain, the neurobiology, and the behavioral symptoms of cluster B personality disorders and addiction are deeply, deeply intertwined. So if the roots are deeply connected, why are so many parts of our healthcare system still only treating the branches? It's a question that challenges the entire status quo of mental health treatment, and it's one we definitely must answer if we truly want to heal the whole person. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer, and keep asking the right questions.